So today, tell me when we're... Okay, so today we're going to be back in the book of Exodus. We're going to be back in chapter 1. It should be lesson 5. You should have your handouts in your seats or in your hands, or if you're a camera person, we have a board. So, see, we're accommodating. So, last week we looked at some of the history leading up to, and then we read through chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Exodus. We're going to have to sort of zoom in, as I have all 49 pages of additional notes today. So, I have to say, first up, this is not all exclusively Bible.ca. It's a good website. I'm just going to give a little plug here. Its biblical archaeology section is really good. I can't necessarily vouch for all the other tabs you could click on, as they're probably dispensational in nature. So just a warning. But the section in the biblical archaeology, he and a couple others are proper Bible-believing archaeologists and do a good job looking at the actual facts and seeing how they actually relate. So I do have you a new handout today. Sorry about being handwritten. It was sort of a last-minute addition. So basically, it just sort of summarizes the line of the pharaohs leading up to Moses. So you see there again, I've got up here in 1557, Moses the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, properly named the Moses dynasty, as all their names. Expels the Hyksos people from northern Egypt, takes over the whole country, re-solidifies the kingdom, reunifies it. On the note of the Hyksos, I did a little more digging, and there's actually many theories and some evidences with names and place linkages that the Hyksos were actually quite possibly Edomites as part of the roving bands that would have spread out. So it is interesting to think. It just adds another level of color, if you will, to why maybe the pure-blooded Egyptians didn't really care for the Semitic family group, especially if it was some of their cousins that had been taken over. So just keep that in mind. But basically, Moses the first expels the Hyksos. His son, and there's a little variation in spelling. Some of it's Imintotep or Amintutep, I think. Regardless, he's the pharaoh specifically mentioned that kills the babies. Okay, the one that tries to get the midwives to commit infanticide. They refuse, so he takes it a step further and orders to be thrown into the Nile. Now, that would be 1526 BC. So it's date. Moses is born and the children are killed in 1526 BC. So now, Amenhotep dies without a son. We know this from the Egyptian kings list. So the next pharaoh, who is Tutmosis I, they're not exactly sure what relation he himself had to the entire dynasty could literally be called lack of firstbornism. And it's almost ironic of the Lord's planning and providence and how the entire line of Egypt here, this dynasty, which so heavily influenced or influencing in the text, has a real problem with secession. So, and we're going to see that. So basically, Tutmosis I comes to the throne. He's not directly the royal bloodline, most likely a high-ranking general, maybe a distant cousin, marries the princess, the crown princess. So effectively, he becomes pharaoh, but the real line is his wife. Okay, well, they together have a daughter. or neck title being daughter of the king. Now, in Egyptian culture, there was a couple feminine titles given to various royal women, one of them being mother of the king, one of them being sister of the king, probably the highest one being royal wife, which is the crowned queen, if you will, and then you have daughter of the king. So, effectively, the daughter. Now, you say, well, wouldn't they all be official? Well, yes and no. As we're about to see, the kings of Egypt were prone to taking multiple wives, so it was possible to have multiple children by multiple wives. So whichever queen is the crowned queen, her children are to take priority, and that's important. So Tutmosis I and his queen have only one living child that survives to adulthood, Hatshepsut. Okay, so we know from the Egyptian kings and queens record that she, from an early age, rises to a level of prominence within the court. And through our dating, I can, with accuracy, state would have been the daughter of Pharaoh that pulled Moses from the water. Or they had her servants pull Moses from the water. One of those points is she's the only time anywhere in the 18th dynasty that a prominent daughter with the proper Egyptian title of daughter of the king, or daughter of Pharaoh in English, features. Secondly, had Moses, and this is again a point of dating against the late dating system, had Moses have been born in the Ramsaic dynasty of the 21st dynasty, he wouldn't have had Moses in his name. Now remember, both Hatshepsut's father is named Moses, and Hatshepsut's maternal grandfather is named Moses. Her mother has Moses in her name. It's the entire dynasty. So it's likely, and we can't say for certain because there's no texture, it's quite likely that Moses may have had something else in his given Egyptian name that he drops when he rejects Egypt. Because mind you, she's the only child of the reigning Pharaoh, which means she's the heir apparent. Okay, which means that her legally adopted child also has an incredibly high status. And as we've said before, in Egyptian law, they were the most egalitarian country in the world at the time. Far cry from where they are today. So the fact that she's the legal royal daughter gives her incredibly high both political and social standing. So just work with that. So, however, Tutmosis I, as most kings do, is unsatisfied with the daughter heir. It happens. Yes?
In favor of the late dating, all the movies I've seen, all of Ten Commandments always say Ramses. I mean, Charlton Heston said Ramses.
Yeah, he did.
Honestly, like seriously, do you think that liberal theories influence those Hollywood movies to some degree with the naming of the pharaohs?
I think that particularly the directors and the coordinators of the script probably just they didn't Google when the commandments came out, but today, they probably just went to whatever textbook and said, oh look, this says Ramses, Moses, without really digging into it. I don't imagine Hollywood was digging into archaeology, and honestly, at the time the Ten Commandments came out, much of this wasn't totally unearthed. So we'll give that one a little bit more grace. They were still studying the archaeology, meaning of the Pharaoh of they're still excavating the Valley of the Kings, which is an interesting note. Tutmosis I was the first pharaoh that said, hey, it's a good idea to hide the bodies away from the funeral temple. Before Tutmosis I, all the pharaohs built massive structures of themselves and entombed themselves underneath it. So Tutmosis I was the first pharaoh to commission a tomb in the Valley of the Kings.
And just so everybody knows, the late date of the Exodus is part of a liberal theory that ultimately says that the entire Bible was written in the Babylonian exile, and everything, Moses is imaginary. So the fact that this correlates with real, not real, but extra biblical history is important.
Right, exactly. And as I said, the article that I'm working heavily with, but Mr. Rudd, he stresses that it shows up in like every fourth paragraph. He's constantly putting in different, and we're going to look at some of them later on. Even later in history, dates confirming it, and I'll just go to touch on it. So fast forward a couple generations, there's these things called the Amarna Tablets. They're effectively royal transcripts from the governors in Palestine back to Thebes, saying, help, the Hebrew are marching on our cities. Now, the Hebrew, if you can't figure it out from the similarity, is the Egyptian derogative term for the Hebrews. Yeah, they called them the Hebrew. And we'll actually look at it. There are multiple recorded tablets that were sent back as reports from the governors explaining how they have already crossed the Jordan, Jericho lies in ruin, this city's fallen, Jerusalem is encamped. Basically, if you don't send reinforcements, Pharaoh, your entire Palestinian stronghold is going to be gone. So very interesting stuff, and we'll look at that. So specifically, though, back to the kings and queens in question, we have Tutmosis I reigning. Now, at the time that Hatshepsut effectively draws Moses from the water, Amenhotep I was still reigning, according to the dating. But it's likely that her mother was already married to her father, therefore, effectively, she was already niece of the Pharaoh. Now, you say, well, he says daughter of the Pharaoh. Well, she's already granddaughter of a Pharaoh. If she's niece of the reigning Pharaoh and heir presumptive as well, because her uncle has no children, and then you take into the fact that Moses is writing it from the completed standpoint. Remember, history is written from whomever's perspective is writing it. So even if at the time, within the narrative, she's not bearing the title necessarily yet, daughter of Pharaoh, it doesn't mean that she isn't daughter of Pharaoh. Does that make sense? Like, it's important to remember that the written log of anything is written in a time and point, and we have to understand what was being understood in that time and point. It's the same way that Moses uses the term Pharaoh to describe king of Egypt throughout the earlier portions of Genesis. We know from Egyptian records that the actual term Pharaoh, up until the 18th dynasty, actually, I wonder if there's any correlation, was only used to refer to the household of Pharaoh and not necessarily the ruler himself. There's actually some linguistic changes that take place with the title usage in the royal house after the 18th dynasty. Who knows? Maybe they decided to cover up something and hide some stuff. Oh, they definitely decided to hide some stuff. And we'll see that. So, Tutmosis I, unsatisfied with a royal daughter, takes a lesser wife, Mutnofret. I think I'd take the first name. It's easier to say. And he has Tutmosis II by his lesser wife. Now, he did not replace his queen, so maybe Henry VIII should take a note. He just simply took another one. But that makes Tutmosis II lesser, because he's out of a lesser wife. He's not the son of the royal queen, the royal wife, which, again, is incredibly important. So in the same way that Tutmosis I is actually royal because he's married to the princess, his son, who is to be his heir, actually lacks some credentials as well. So what you see is, in typical fashion, he marries the two together. So Tutmosis II and Hatshepsut get married. Now, stepbrothers and stepsisters were super common. Full-blooded siblings are common within the 18th dynasty. As I said, they had a real problem with succession. So what's interesting, though, is Hatshepsut at this time would already have adopted Moses. So there is a legal adopted heir in the household. Now that's important, because in Egyptian law, adoptions are legally binding and put the adopted child in the same position in the birthright that they would have been if they were natural born. Now, mind you, Moses is adopted by Hatshepsut when she's approximately 15, give or take a few years based on the dating. So, Moses is already there. Arguably, he could be, he may only be several years younger than his adopted half-stepfather, who will end up being Pharaoh. So that's sort of the environment, that we're working with. You've got Tutmosis II, who is younger than his half-sister queen, her adopted son, who happens to be a Hebrew, one of the slave population, though I'm sure the royal family did all they could to mask that. And then to top it all off, Tutmosis II and Hatshepsut only have one biological child together, and it's another princess, Neferure. These names took me a little while to work through them all. So again, Tutmosis III, or Tutmosis II, is in the same position that his father finds himself in that we know this, that again, you have almost, if you will, a degrading line of Pharaoh. You see that the actual male kings, the male pharaohs of Egypt, their line continues to weaken, if you will. Do you guys need one? So, effectively, we can see that, and then we look at the text, and we see a new king arises over Egypt, Ahmosis I. We see the king casting the infant sons into the Nile. We then see Moses' family, and we're given specific information there that it's a man of Levi and a woman of Levi. So you have a pedigree on Moses' side, on the Hebrew side of things. We see how Moses' mother protects him in faith and hedging her bets by both picking the best spot possible, but also trusting the Lord, because the Nile is not exactly the safest spot for an infant in a basket. We see this happening. We also know from the historical side of things that of what's going on in the political court. Now, according to, get over to my multiple notes here. Okay, this one's got some dates on it. Okay. So we know that Moses is born in 1526. You've got the drama going on in the court. The exact time, let's see if I can find. That is a lot of information to process. So we know that Moses, on his 40th birthday, or in his 40th year, not birthday, but we'll read the account, goes out into the land to see his people, sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, kills the Egyptian, hides him in the sand, thinks he gets away with it. The next day, he secrets out, so he flees. Now, during that time frame, all of this time, Moses is being raised as literally the crown prince of Egypt, if my dating and everything's correct, because he is the legal, therefore binding son of the crown princess, who by this point is queen, the royal wife of Pharaoh. And not only that, but Tutmosis II did not have a son born to him until much later, almost 30 years after Moses was born. So Moses is actually, approximately according to the dating, 30 years older than his adopted step half-brother. It's a mouthful. You figure that one out in family court. So for 30 years, it's Moses and his adopted sister, Neferure, most likely, if everything works out. So a prince and a princess in the royal house being raised by Tutmosis II and Hatshepsut in the palace. 30 years is a long time. And there's still no blood-born heir showing up. So, as we know from history, and if anybody's studied any of the other monarchies or dynasties throughout the world, they're not just the king and his immediate family. There's nobles, there's courtiers. There's a lot going on. So just imagine if you've got an heir presumptive for 30 years, and then finally a half-blood baby brother's born 30 years later. Even if that is the blood-born son of the king, there's probably going to be a lot of people in court that are questioning it. Besides, Moses is the legal-born or legal adopted son of Hatshepsut, who's the rightful line carrier through her and her mother all the way back to the founder of the dynasty. So, imagine in court here, there's going to be some tension going on. So, when we read in the narrative what goes on when Moses does this, imagine, he's got a younger extended family sibling that's about 10 at this point. This happens, he has reason to fear. He's not necessarily the heir presumptive, even if he technically is. There's competition going on. And as everybody knows, the blood-born sons always seem to take precedent. So that just sort of paints the picture of what's really going on. Now, the year after, according to the dating and according to the Egyptian kings list, the year after Moses flees to Midian, Tutmosis II dies. Well, Hatshepsut basically becomes co-regent with a approximately 9 to 11-year-old Tutmosis III and begins reigning. So this is the scenario that's playing out while Moses is away for 40 years. So, let's see here. Yeah, it's a bit of process, but I do want to read the chapter 2 of Exodus. I want to read the account of Moses fleeing. It's verse 11, chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed an Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So with the historical knowledge of what's going on, it makes a whole lot more sense and even adds weight, if you will, that, his adopted stepfather, who now has his own blood-born son, has a whole lot more reason to get rid of that annoying adopted, heir. Because he wants Tutmosis II, most certainly will want Tutmosis III on the throne. So it fleshes out the fact that real people, real times, real politics, and the text captures that, but I think sometimes we're stuck in the 21st century and we just read the narrative and it's just words coming off a page. But, Moses, and I don't have my map up here because I needed to put this out, but effectively he's fleeing from Thebes, which if you remember is in Lower Egypt, going this way across the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to Midian over on the other side. It wasn't a light journey to undertake. Now, you say, why would he have went there? Well, I should have got another marker board and had a map as well. At the time, the 18th dynasty is nearing the climax of its power. Okay, they control all of Egypt. They have Nubia and Sudan under their control in the south. Okay, Tutmosis II has launched campaigns into Canaan and is currently occupying all of Canaan all the way to Syria and had an envoy in Babylon. Okay, so the only place left for Moses to run is this little hill patchy country of Midian over here that the Pharaoh hasn't bothered to march chariots across the mountains to get to. So it's not that it wasn't coincidence, it's providence, but from the human perspective, Moses was out of options. And yet this is the spot that the Lord intended for him to be, as is always the case, and we're going to see what happens. So, verse 16 of chapter 2. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Now the shepherds came down and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. And when they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us, and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left this man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Continuing on, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because their slavery and cried out for help. their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So from the text, we're given a very clear picture. Moses flees. During this time, he meets Zipporah, he marries Zipporah, a son is born, and the text even tells us that the Pharaoh dies. Now, there actually could be referring to two things. It could be referring to Tutmosis II dying soon after his exile, but it also could be referring to the fact that Hatshepsut dies I think it's, let's see, I have to check the number's blurred. Effectively, she reigns for like 13 years, I think it is, as co-regent before dying herself, leaving Tutmosis III as the sole pharaoh. So it's also possible that you have Hatshepsut dying, who, even though as a queen, technically was ruling as a co-pharaoh. It wasn't uncommon for them to strap on their fake beard, put on the pharaoh's headdress, and basically become a man to rule the nation. As I said, they're egalitarian, but they're also practical. If you're dealing with foreign men dignitaries, it's probably better if you aren't a woman. No offense to any of you ladies out there in this time frame. We have busts and statues of Hatshepsut, clearly a female because she's clothed. Okay, the men of ancient Egypt only wore clothes from the waist down. It's hot and they're in palaces, so they typically wouldn't wear anything up here besides a sash. Anytime there's a female pharaoh, and there were a few, they're always clothed up on the top because they're decent, because they actually had rules in society. But we see Hatshepsut clothed as a lady, but also wearing a strap-on beard, and you can see the strap on the statue wearing the pharaoh's hat. And we have inscriptions of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, co-regent Tutmosis III. Yes?
Is your beard real?
Yeah.
Heather had a question.
Yeah. I have a question. So back, like in verse 11, when the Egyptian is beating the Hebrew, like it says that it's one of Moses' brethren, you know?
Yeah.
So how did he know he was a Hebrew? Like, was he older? Like was he old enough to know once he went to the palace, or did they raise him?
I would make the case that he probably knew. Like, it probably wasn't a court secret. It might have been somewhat of a secret, but at least within the household, you really can't hide it. They look different. It's not, two people, it's two totally different ethnic bloodlines. This is one area where the Disney movie probably gets it right. Ramses was portrayed fairly fair-skinned with black hair, even though Ramses isn't the pharaoh. But in the movie is. And Moses is portrayed with brownish skin with brown ruddy hair. So we don't know the exact genetics going on, but there most likely would have been a difference.
I mean, I know, like, in the movie, like, the best I remember from childhood is that he meets Miriam.
Yeah, and that's just, dramatic adaptation.
Yeah.
Could he have visited the family?
Yeah, I mean, the text doesn't tell us, but it does say, and it's important to see what it does say as opposed to what it doesn't say. When he's of age, he goes out to see his people. Now, that's the possessive pronoun. So Moses knew that he was a Hebrew. Now, whether or not he was going specifically to his house that he is from, the text doesn't tell us. Nor does it truly matter, though last week we addressed that it's likely Moses' family, or at least that line of Levi, was probably living and working fairly near the palace, just because of the association. Because as a mother on foot with a basket, you don't walk miles to the Nile, So, yes.
I just wanted to add also, in terms of his awareness of his heritage, it may have been, the fact that when Pharaoh's daughter assigned Moses' mother to raise him, ultimately, that it was very likely that it was not a secret, meaning, or if it was like an open secret, so to speak, where they had basically Pharaoh's daughter had compassion on the fact that she knew it was one of the Hebrews, and so she had compassion in her heart for Moses as an infant.
Right.
And so it may have been, she may have been openly telling him, and then even Pharaoh's mother, who raised him, may have told him, So
and that is a good point, because we don't always quite get the text or understand. But in the text, when it says, "May I go get a woman to nurse him for you," it's both the physical nourishment of a young child with his mother, but also that same concept. A nurse would typically raise a child, and this actually persisted all the way probably till the 1800s with the nobility around the world, till they're 3 or 4. So whomever was nursing, in this case Moses' own mother, he would have been a small child before been fully in the palace. So yes, Andy.
There's a verse in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, that comments on that. Maybe you had that.
Yeah, but if you want to read it, that'd be great.
Yeah, it said, by faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead for his reward.
Right. No, and that, we see there, but the author of Hebrews gives us a very clear, obviously, from this side of the spectrum, image, which is often helpful with clarity there. Specifically, he's refusing. Now, at what point that transition is most likely I killed somebody, I'm in trouble, time to get out of here. But it's see that verse is not just hinting on Moses' fear of retribution, but there's more to it. If he was just afraid of being killed, it wouldn't have been anything to get out of Egypt. Now, he was afraid of being killed, but there's more, and we'll look at that again upon Moses' return. But yeah, it's very important to see there you have this dynamic playing out, and most likely, as a small child, he was among the Hebrews. He knew, it says his people, he clearly knew who it was. There's just legal superstructure in place. He's adopted by now the queen. So
a couple things. It's really interesting what you just said about the nursing issue, because I was just looking at another scripture yesterday, just comparing scriptures, it's on a different topic. In 1 Thessalonians 2:7, when it says, "We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children," it's actually, the word mother is not there. It's actually just like a nurse.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then in Exodus, I think it's part of what the conversation we were just having, the repetition of the Egyptian in the passage. So, he strikes down the Egyptian, then they say you killed the Egyptian, but then he goes and, when he's meeting Zipporah and her sisters, they say an Egyptian delivered us. So they're talking about Moses, so
right.
He's still retaining the appearance in some way.
Yeah. Well, and that's just it. His skin color would have been different, but if you, and I guess the Disney movie shows it okay, if he's fleeing in robes and his royal attire, by the time he gets there, it's in tatters, but you can clearly see, nobody in any part around there dressed like the Egyptians. Okay, they had a elitist thing going on and did for much of history. So it was clear. If you were dressed like an Egyptian, everybody knew you were an Egyptian. You would have had, even with your hair growing out, which would have been a big deal because they kept it clean shaven and incredibly manicured in Egypt. Even after that journey, it would have still been noticeable. He wasn't wearing the rough spun robes of the Bedouin farmers. It would have been actually a very uncomfortable journey across the desert wearing Egyptian clothes. Because sandals and a light thing down here, and yeah, that's about it. So, so we see Moses having this transition, and it's this point, we're told in the last section of chapter 2, Pharaoh dies and the people are enslaved. Now, textually, there's no specific reference to Hatshepsut in the text, and likewise, there's no specific reference in the king's list to the Hebiru in Egypt at this time, but there is. Let me see, and I meant to make a few copies of this picture. Let's see if I can find it because it's sort of small. But in the tomb, and I'm going to have to find it to get the name right. Where is it? This is what happens when you have like 40 pages in front of you. Here we go. So in the tomb, of Reckmeyer, and pronounced in English, it's probably Rickmire, who happened to be the vizier to Tutmosis III. There's some very interesting murals depicting Hebrew slaves making mud bricks under the reign of Tutmosis III. Now, if you want to talk about liberal squashing, this is one where they're going to try their hardest. So I'll just pass this around. These are two photographs taken from this particular tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Yeah, they're for the camera people. And if you want to just circulate it, people can look at it. These are two murals in the vizier's tomb. So again, we know the vizier, as we learned from when studying Joseph, is basically prime minister. So he's handling all of the domestic and international stuff for Pharaoh. Pharaoh basically was commander-in-chief of the armed forces and demigod among men for publicity. So he's like a military celebrity. That's basically Pharaoh's job. The vizier actually handled all the other stuff, the important parts. So it's interesting to see that in this tomb of the vizier who served under Tutmosis III, there's actual depictions of foreign, most likely Hebrew slaves, making mud bricks, very specifically matching the description we get from the text later on. Now, we also know that while up until this point, you have this transition in the 18th dynasty, where before the Hebrews were prosperous. They're in northern Egypt. They had trading centers, with the Hyksos pharaohs. If they didn't have an alliance, they at least were on good trading terms. The 18th dynasty comes in and the oppression begins. Okay, you have the killing of the male children. Okay, and it just amps up, basically. And at this point, it actually makes a lot of sense why the oppression gets that much. One, you've got two pharaohs, co-regency here. You've got Tutmosis III, who doesn't much care for his older half-step adopted sibling. So who happens to be Hebrew, mind you. So he kills an Egyptian, runs away. Tutmosis III sees it as hey, here's an opportunity. But two, you have the wrath of a queen scorned. Now, mind you, Hatshepsut has adopted this Hebrew, raised this Hebrew, basically to be her line because she did not bear any male children with Tutmosis III, or the second. Okay, so she has no one but Moses to carry on her own line. Now, so a good way to put it, the power of an individual politician throughout much of history is often vested with their successor. This is why Henry VIII had such a problem with weird ways to fix it. So for Hatshepsut, who was royal daughter and now royal wife, she's effectively a politician in her own right. And the queens were. They had their own retinues. They actually had their own palaces. They have a political force. Well, Moses is that line, if you will. He's effectively of the line of the queen, not the line of the pharaoh specifically. But this whole time, she knows this, and she's going, So if this is the case, then when he turns his back on her, and Hebrews 11 tells us specifically that this is exactly what it is in the grand picture, and runs away, not only do you have the younger stepbrother who doesn't like him, but then you have his adopted mother's wrath potentially coming into play of, look what I did for you and you treat me this way. Well, watch what I'm going to do to the rest of your people. And we know, that from the biblical archaeology perspective, the liberals won't tell you, but we do know that there was a massive uptick in slave labor during Tutmosis' entire reign, both the regency and then the first half and then the second half. Well, there's a lack of slaves in the second half. But in the first two sections of Tutmosis III's reign, there was a massive uptick in slave labor in Egypt for building. In fact, there were some many great structures built during this time frame.
So they became slaves?
What?
During his reign?
Most likely. Up until this point, you see levels of oppression being pushed down, but we don't necessarily know at what point they went from being a second-rate citizen to this, but we do know from the text that one of the pharaohs, or the collective thought of the house of Pharaoh, is we need to oppress them, and it keeps getting worse. And we do know that by the time Moses returns, they're making bricks. They're working the hard jobs. They're in the fields. So there's likely a transition that happens from Moses being born, because the text doesn't tell us the slavery aspect as much as just the general oppression between the races, this sort of thing. It doesn't mean some of them weren't, but we definitely seem to see a ramping up. So bad that at the end of chapter 2, you see, during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. They cried for rescue from their slavery, came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant. Okay, so that's how Moses ends chapter 2, and it sort of capstones the situation. I think we're about good on time. I think that's a good spot to stop to, historically and textually. Any final questions? Comments? Interesting. There. If not, I will pray for us and we will close. Lord, we thank you for this day and for this beautiful weather you've given us, and the freedom and the health to assemble here together, to study your word and to worship you, Lord. We ask your blessing upon the coming service and the blessing on all those gathered here.